Hello, good afternoon. Let me start by introducing Derek to you. Derek is a farmer and nature conservationist. He's been involved in bringing back our native wildlife species for over 35 years, playing a significant role in the reintroduction of species such as the water vole, the whitestalk, and of course the beaver, first on his own farm and then more widely to restore landscapes and wildlife in Britain. Derek is also the author of his brilliant book, Bringing Back the Beaver, which is a first-hand account of his work to reintroduce the beaver to the British landscape, with the support and applause of many, but also in the face of outright opposition from the government, some landowners, and even some conservation beaver professionals. Derek has imported, quarantined, and insisted in the re-establishment of beaver populations in waterways across England and Scotland. And alongside some seriously funny stories about these experiences in the book, Bringing Back the Beaver also makes a passionate case for why beavers, one of nature's great problem solvers, are so crucial as a sustainable fix to our flooding problems in the UK. In the words of Isabella Tree, who wrote the foreword, to many of the government officials, farmers, anglers, landowners, and conservationists with whom he has locked horns, Derek is a one-man wrecking ball, a cowboy operating outside the law, and a complete pain in the arse. Some of his friends may say the same. But perhaps Derek's greatest contribution yet to the future of the beaver in Britain may be his ability to break down barriers, bash heads together, inform, cajole, inspire, and excite. He is not your archetypal nature conservationist. Derek and I are going to talk a bit about his work with the beaver. He's going to read a couple of bits from the book, and then we can take questions. There'll be time at the end for you to ask Derek some questions. But first, I think you're going to start with a reading of when you first met the beaver. A beaver.
I'll do that, but before I begin, I'll say thank you very much indeed, Muna. Thank you all for coming. It's been the most incredible journey. When I started to work with beavers, other people had tried to reintroduce the species to Britain before. There had been some early thinking about the restoration in the 1930s. And then in the 1970s, the Forestry Commission at Groundswell made a serious attempt to bring beavers in initially from Canada because they did not know at that time there was a difference, and then to ultimately bringing beavers in from Sweden. The idea was dismissed by the JNCC at the time within a fortnight, which is nearly a record timescale for them to make a decision about anything, given the level of hesitation they normally show. And they said, no, you can't do this. And one of the commissioners from the Forestry Commission, a chap called Campbell, who sat on the board and had to go and tell Jack Chard and John Cubby that this idea, which he thought was very good, had effectively died in an afternoon, said that he couldn't understand why they did it. And as he spent the next 30 years looking at the fight to reintroduce beavers in Knapdale and to consider the restoration in England and Wales as well unfold, he said he still couldn't understand why they did it. And in the end, his conclusion was they knew absolutely nothing about the subject, and they decided just to clear their desk fast. And that's what happens when you come up with new ideas. And this isn't a new idea. It's been the most incredible journey. It has been at times very confrontational, but it also has at times become something that's been massively collaborative. And it's been interesting to see a situation unfold whereby farmers and landowners and organisations like Chrissy's, which used to be the great Satan when he worked for the CLA, in the end became one of the best and most sensible and pragmatic allies there was when it came to restoring this animal that we hunted to extinction in the late 1700s. So when I began with beavers, and we talked to people about beavers, my principal interest in this animal was that I had been working with water voles. Water voles are a nature conservation tragedy in this country, despite millions having been spent on their conservation over the years since it was first recognised, I guess, in the early 1990s, that the species was fast fading from the map of Britain, and that once common animal was only clinging on in pockets. Things haven't got any better, things have only got worse, because what we seem determined to do is repeat forever the mistakes we make in the past to make absolutely sure we reinforce failure. When I started working with water voles in 2004, and the species was a biological action plan target, it was estimated there was a national population of 1.2 million animals. By 2019, it was estimated that had fallen to 130,000. And this year, and I'm sure the news will come out on a day when it's a good news day to hide bad news, you will be told there are about 77,000 left. And if you think this is a tragedy from a kind of Kenneth Graham illustrative point of view, and we're just looking at this little guy in his hat sculling up and down the Windrush with his pal the toad and his mole smoking his pipe and wearing his fore and aft hat, then think again. This is a little animal that has a big impact on riverbank environments. It has a big impact on plant dispersal. In those riverbank environments, when it gorgonzolas the soil, it provides refugia for grass snakes, for a whole host of other creatures. When it collapses banks, kingfishers burrow into them, and they use the bare soil surfaces to create nests and homes for their chicks. And when I started to work with them, we were diligently looking at digging ponds for water voles, felling willow to create ideal water vole habitat, moving plants around, doing a whole variety of very high intervention things to create a better future for this little creature. Killing mink was one of them. But the more you did these things, the more you realised that these creatures must have been dependent on a process that existed before that was natural. Because when you look at aggregations of prehistoric mammal bones in Britain at places like Thatcham and Starcar, water voles are super abundant. They've always been super abundant. They were a very important part of our food chain once, and they were a very important part of the food chain for a whole range of different raptorial species. So they were once a common animal. Why did we get to a point where they were just living in lines in the land? So when we're reintroducing them, we're very seldom reintroducing them to suitable wetlands. We're typically putting them into riverbanks where the water meets an edge, comes up 2 or 3 metres, with reasonably good vegetation, and then you're into the farmland, or you're then into some other environment which is completely inhospitable for them. And it became abundantly obvious that there had to be a process that made other living space to sustain this once abundant creature. And that process, as soon as you started to look at what beavers did, creating complex pool mosaics that were open, sunny, well vegetated, had to be tied in with the activity of this much larger relative. And the more you look at the ecology of a broad range of wetland wildlife, and this is very well studied in both continental Europe and in North America, the more you realise that everything that lives in a wetland is tied into a beaver. The North Americans will tell you, because we talk about keystone species way too much, that this creature is not a keystone species. It's a function of nature. It's part of nature's ability to create sponges, to slow the flow, to create living space for other creatures, and that when you take the beavers away, what you have following fairly rapidly is ecological catastrophe. So my journey with the beavers began when there were no beavers, when there were maybe a few old Canadian beavers, then zoos. But when we decided, prompted by Roy Dennis, who's a very, very persistent man and never takes no for an answer, that we had to actually go and find some beavers, we didn't know where to start. Eurasian beavers were not commonly available in zoos in Western Europe. And it was eventually at a conference in Holland that I met a man who said, well, what you've got to do is you've got to go and speak to the Poles, because in Poland, they have a state breeding farm at a place called Popielno, which was built in the time of Stalin to initially provide beavers to restock the Russian Far East with a fur-bearing species from which revenues could be drawn down. And then as our knowledge grew in Russia with regard to the importance of the creature for its ecological worth alone. So the beaver building was vast. It was an aircraft hangar of asbestos and grim external concrete enclosures. It was Soviet and severe. When the door opened, the inside service passage along its right-hand side stretched off into dim infinity. You could not see its end. The beavers were living in huge pools which were filled by the lake water from the Missourian lakes, and they had little concrete huts to substitute for their lodges. An attendant called Hubert Nuglowski, who spoke no English, and I spoke no Polish, and I can tell you nobody in Poland wanted to speak in German as an interim language. That was a jolly unpopular move. They leant down into one of the little chambers that the beavers were in, and there on a bed of finely split wood tucked tightly together was the most splendidly snug beaver family. Some slept twitching and snoring gently on their backs, with the tiny ones curled tightly into the folds of their sides like furry grapefruit, round and soft. Scented and warm, they mewed and slowly began to unfurl as Hubert spoke gently and stroked them with the palm of his hand. Others slumbered until the movements of their bedfellows stirred them awake. There were black beavers, the first I'd ever seen, and tiny gingerbread juveniles. A tubby teenage 1-year-old turned upright to stretch itself flat, yawning with its forepaws extended and its incisors exposed. A baby whimpered and cried. Their large, dark mother uncoloured, and by doing so exposed the 4 pink nipples in her chest to be still engorged like chipolatas. She spoke softly to Hubert, and he spoke to her. Then he leant forward and lifted her carefully into his arms. The interpreter told me to sit outside on the step of the shed, and when I did, he passed her to me. She settled into my lap with her great leather tail turned beneath her and turned her head upwards towards my face looking down. I have seldom known such rapture.
Magical. What's interesting to me about your work is, as a member of the public, we're taught not to value just one species above all the others. But for you, from what you say, the beaver is, you call it an ecological engineer, an architect of a landscape. The beaver creates the ecosystem.
The beaver creates living space, and initially when we start to talk about water voles and we say, well, okay, it's a kind of watery animal, you would think it would live in an open, sunny wetland. When you then start to talk about newts and you look at some of the study work that's been done by Devon Wildlife Trust on their trial site at a place called Bold Venture, which started to look at analysing exactly what impact beavers had in a 3-hectare wetland in 2014, when they did their initial studies of amphibians like common frogs. Because there were no beavers and because there were no pools, there were 10 small clumps of common frog spawn on that one site at the beginning of the study trial. 4 years in, there were 650. And when you start to look, you go to Europe or North America and you look at the complexity of other amphibians that still survive there, what you find is that species after species after species is adapted to a specific environment the beaver creates, or is adapted to exploit the opportunities that the beavers provide. Now that we've started to work on to looking at the restoration of other species and the idea of restoring wildcats to England is starting to gain traction, because of course this is a creature that's not Scottish. It was found from the very tip of Cornwall right to the tip of Caithness. Not so long ago, before we started to call them vermin and turned our mind completely to their extermination, then you find that this uses beaver-generated wetlands as well. Time and again, when we've been to Switzerland and Austria to talk to people about the reintroduction of wildcats, I've asked people if they ever see them hunting in beaver-generated wetlands, where there are lots of small mammals and amphibians and prey opportunities that are commonly not out there in the farmland. And what you find is that in German-farmed environments, which are commonly quite as intensively utilised as ours, is they just say, well, we don't really know, Derek, because there aren't very many wetlands. And then you go and you speak to the Greeks, and they say, well, we're not quite sure. We'll trek the trail cameras we have up in the Rodhopi Mountains, where we're surveying for a very broad range of mammal species, and within 2 weeks they come back, and there's footage from their cameras of a female wildcat sitting next to a beaver pool, which is boiling full of frogs, and just languidly reaching its paw down to try and hook them if it can. Everything that lives uses the wetlands. They're the richest living environment there is on the planet, and we cannot possibly attempt to recover nature in Britain if we don't start to look at the restoration of the wetlands first. And we can't restore biodiverse wetlands without beavers. It's as simple as that.
And in terms of flood management, what work do they do there?
Well, Beavers have a huge impact on water management. So again, from research work that's been done both in North America and Russia, we know that beaver channels, beaver-generated wetlands, hold 10 times the volume of water that a normal channel would otherwise hold. Again, if you look at the study site in Devon, in a 3-hectare area of relic willow carr and wetland that the beavers have redeveloped, there are a series of maybe, I think, 14 main impoundments. Some are short in land that is more incised, some are broad, where the land is flatter. But the long and the short of it is that in a stream section that does not run in the summer, there's no water flow into it, and rages through in the winter, devastating the banks of his next door neighbour's land at the other side, the beavers are now storing somewhere in the region of about 1,000 cube of water, which is there pretty much right the way through the summer, and which simply wouldn't be there if the beavers weren't there. The water comes in fast at a time of heavy rainfall and spate, and then because the landscape in between, again in the 150 metres, is now super absorbent by felling trees and raising groundwater levels, plants like sphagnum moss are allowed to reform, and that moss in its own right can absorb somewhere in the region of 60 times its own volume of water when it becomes wet. So the plants change, the amount of detritus changes, you have very many obstacles because when the trees are brought down, you don't have a flat surface for the water to flow over, you have a complicated surface, and all these things in totem that beavers do, and don't just think they make dams and impoundments and wetlands that are small. If you look at, you go to some of the beaver sites in Russia or North America, and you look at from the air, they're forest breakers. They operate on a scale that can be truly vast. Then these landscapes slow the flow and retain water peaks. I mean, Archie, who's sitting over there, will probably tomorrow speak about just exactly what they do at Finchingfield in a very dry farmed landscape in Essex, where an excellent monitoring programme has been undertaken on his land, which defines quite clearly exactly what impact beavers have on water retention in a landscape that's almost always in the summertime otherwise dry. So, they slow the flow of water. In addition to that, their dams act as natural filters. So it's been quite clearly demonstrated again and again that they can absorb the nitrates that run off the land from heavily fertilized farmland. The plants in the beaver-generated environments grow very rapidly in response, and by doing so, they become more succulent. They produce more aphids, and the aphids produce more predators of aphids. They're also capable of, when the silts come down, of retaining somewhere in the region of 80% of the silts that are lost to diffuse agricultural pollution. And when you retain the silts, the phosphate ions, again from the fertilizers, are attached to them by electrolysis. So beaver-generated wetlands in heavily utilised agricultural environments play a huge role in silt retention, slowing the flow, drought resilience, and then chemical capture as well.
I mean, you have just mentioned some of the things, the size of the dams, the felling, the chopping down of trees. These are held as reasons why, the reasons why so many people have been opposed to your work, but they're myths. I mean, again, you mentioned how throughout Europe, most of the waterways have beavers, populations of beavers. So what has happened here? Why have these myths taken such hold?
It's complete ignorance, and it's manipulation of ignorance. What you find is that there are different organisations, different individuals in the past who've basically picked no as an answer and then tried to find a justification of that position. Before we deal with trees and we deal with beaver dams and fish, I've sat in plenty of farming meetings where people have jumped up and down and screamed and come up with a big list of reasons why you can't have beavers in Britain. The best of which ever was that some clown said the Elizabethans, as the Elizabethans identified them as vermin, the Elizabethans must have known something about this animal that we didn't. Okay. Bear in mind the Elizabethans were the people who were burning witches left, right and centre, and whose church was also debating how they were going to have a conversation with the tribes of dog-headed people they expected to meet in South America when you turned round to their chief and said, "Can I give you some beads for Honduras?" And he went, "Woof." So at the end of it all, that was the best one. But that's just a pinnacle of myth. When you look at trees, in the first instance, and aquatic trees, These trees have a relationship with this animal, which is approximately 40 million years old. So you cut a willow down, it coppices rapidly. Then when it seeds, if the seed lands on wetland, the seed grows to a metre height in a year. Poplar takes from random cuttings, so beavers are untidy feeders. When tiny little bits of bark and stick wash away and land in a rich silt bed, the trees regrow again. Alder takes from cuttings. Aspen suckers. Tree after tree after tree after tree has adapted in a different way to its predation by beavers. I mean, my knowledge of willow types, which are complex, is not great. But we have a form on our farm where there are beavers, which is multi-stemmed. And what you find that tree does, and it's the simplest thing ever, now its beauty and its simplicity, is that the central stem in the middle of a pocket of stems always comes away, because the beavers felt all the other leaders going up round the side, then they coppice and become sharp, and it's just too difficult for them to get into the central part of the tree. So the tree survives in a whole multiplicity of different ways. There is no issue with the trees, none at all. We're the problem, and the overstocking of domestic livestock's the problem as far as riparian trees are concerned. As far as beavers and salmonids are concerned, I've attended so many conferences the world over on beavers and beaver conservation and beaver ecology. Take your pick. I mean, you go speak to people in Sweden about it, they will tell you there is no issue. You speak to the Norwegians who have a healthy wild salmon industry, they will tell you there is no issue, and there's plenty of evidence of beavers living right the way through the wild salmon runs and the wild salmon prospering and doing well. A few years ago, I was on the west coast of North America in the Cascades, and we were lucky enough to go and see some of the fisheries scientists who were working with coho and steelhead salmon. And they were out on a river on a hot sunny day, catching all these young smolts in a trap, pit tagging them and weighing them. And when we explained we were from the UK, and there's, I don't know, at that time, very few beavers floating around Britain, and how much concern there was about them building dams and stopping the migration of Atlantic salmon, one of the guys nearly fell into the river from the bank because he was laughing so much. And he said, you do understand this is all nonsense, and that we cannot recover these fish unless we have complications in the watercourse, unless we have, a rich abundance of the insects that shred dead timber, unless we have these big trees falling in that create lays for the big game fish moving upriver, unless you have the shoals that result, when a tree falls in and gathers gravel, and they can then later spawn in them at a different time in the future. And he said, all of that is provided by the beaver. So where this idea comes from in Britain is just beyond me. It does. It just comes from ignorance. It comes from obstinacy. It comes from one principal fisheries group which is determined they shall not be here, whereas many others are looking at it and thinking they could deliver much. And they are determined to ensure that the beaver reintroduction is viewed by government in a dim light and determined to be as obstructive as they possibly can be. But when it comes to it, the evidence base they have to substantiate their position isn't even alphabetically slim. It's less than that.
And yet the British public love the beaver. It's in our place names. It's in our history.
It's in our place names. It's in our history. And we live at an interesting time in history. We live, you're all here at the farming conference. We're all talking about farming for the next couple of days. And it's going to change like you would not believe. The time of old certainties, of subsidies and support, of untrammeled political power is slipping. It's not even slipping away fast. It's slipped and gone. We're going to live and we're going to enter a new dawn of reality. A reality where, yes, we still need food, but the old idea you're just going to pay people to farm for the sake of them being farmers and owning land is finishing. And it's going to produce huge change, because at the end of the day, we have farming as an industry that dominates, I don't know what percentage of the British Isles, but probably somewhere in the region of 70-80% of the landscape. And the support that's kept very many people farming simply won't be there anymore. But up until now, what has always happened when it comes to wider society expressing an opinion on something is, it's been largely ignored. If you look at the work that was done in Knapdale at the beginning, you would have initial public responses to the idea of reintroducing beavers, which would run in the region of 67%. And that really wouldn't be a good enough end result. So there'd be maybe 3 or 4 years of kicking the can in the long grass. And then what should we do? I'll tell you what, let's commission another public feasibility or a public enthusiasm study with regard to beavers. And that result would show you there's 89% of people, by the time you've talked about it, who think it's a really good idea. But still, even then, 1% or 2% of people say no, and the answer's no. And it's simply not tenable. I mean, I met the Prime Minister in August to have a chat about beavers going out into an enclosure on his dad's farm. Now, that hasn't happened yet, but it really was a very interesting conversation. We had conversations along the same sort of line with Michael Gove when he was Secretary of State for the Environment. And it has to be said that I really do think at the top of politics that there are people who absolutely understand the concern that people have for a depleted a depleted landscape in Britain that is now so bare of wildlife that when you walk across huge farms and estates, you can barely find a meadow pipit. It's really, really scary that there's enthusiasm for looking at this again and saying, you know, we have to change. We have to do things differently. You know, we have to reshape this landscape. So, yes, it's still good for people. It's still good for farming. It's still good for commercial forestry. But it has to be good for nature as well. And it has to become more resilient with regard to global warming and the other climate threats that are going to face us. So there is will at the top of government, I believe, to change things. Quite how it's going to work out, there are people in this room who are better placed than I am to say how ELMS is going to work. It's a great white hope that I'm sure many of you who are farming are hoping is going to deliver much. But there is no clarity, as I understand it yet, of just exactly what it's going to pay for and how much it's going to pay for it. So it's a time of tremendous change, and in this change, the support from the top down, which there never was before, for the restoration and re-establishment of this animal.
I mean, you talk of change, but you've already made the change. I mean, you started sheep farming at the age of 10.
Yep.
A few years ago, you rewilded 150 acres. How did you come to that decision?
How did I come to that decision? In the end, when we were farming at scale and we were running 1,500 breeding ewes, which gives you, 2,500, 3,000 sheep running over your land and 400 beef cattle, which was all quite normal. You spend 6-7 years doing it, and you do it hard because that's what everybody else is doing, and then you turn around and you look at your land and you see the last short-eared owl passing through and the last of the whimbrel on one day. You see one pair of curlews once and a solitary bird after that, and never again. And then you begin to understand from colleagues you have outside farming that these birds you're seeing are the last of the old birds that are 30, 40 years old and that will die never having reproduced in their lives. And it becomes something that really begins to wear on your conscience. There are plenty of people still doing that. I have no intention of doing it anymore. I'm sick of waking up in the middle of the night worrying about limping sheep and what bunch I'm going to bring in tomorrow to sort their putrid feet. I'm not doing it anymore. The biggest mistake I made when I finished the bulk of the sheep was I kept 20 because my son has turned into a sheep farming zealot and is determined that this is going to be his future. And it was the worst mistake I ever bloody made. The bastards have, even despite the neglect that we burdened them with at lambing time, the things are thriving like mushrooms. And they've gone from 20 to 150. And now again, I'm waking up at night worrying about limping sheep. And it's bloody over. So this Saturday, Sunday afternoon, the shearer comes, we shear them, we clixon them for the last time, we turn them out for another 6 weeks, and then every bastard sheep that is on the farm walks off it. And that's it. The cattle, we need to keep cattle. We need to have good suckler cows of old, rare breeds that are sustainable. We need, as many other people have done successfully, to establish a meat market for the high-quality beef these produce, both in the meadows we've reseeded with wildflowers and the meadows we will reseed with wildflowers. And by the time we finish and we look at, chopping these big bullocks down to tiny little bits of salami and biltong and whatever else there is, we'll make just as much money from a small herd of beef cattle that we ever did from a profit point of view, keeping all these other animals that it just seemed right to keep. So, but stepping back, and I don't know if anybody else here feels the same, and getting out of the culture of sort of like looking at all your next door neighbours cutting hay and thinking, God, I should be doing that as well, but I have so many sheep, that's how much hay I've got in my fields, is actually a very difficult thing to do. And even now, when you contemplate, getting rid of the last, you look at them and think, well, my mum liked that one came from somebody else's flock, and you can see all these things dragging you down. So the best thing we do is we clip them, we have 4 cans of cider, and then we just book the lorry, take them all to the abattoir on Monday morning, and that's it, done. They're a good price at the moment, it's a good time to get out of sheep, do it if you can.
But your work is not just against the sheep and for the beaver. Your farm actually is a wildlife centre for many other species that you want to reintroduce to our landscape. What are the next ones for you?
It's become that. I mean, I spent about 16 years working in zoos. In 1990, I went to Gerald Durrell Zoo, and I don't know how many people... Hands up, everybody who's read a Gerald Durrell book. Woohoo, okay? Like Gerald, I became inspired by his work and inspired by his vision. Never met the man, met his wife, met very many people who knew him well. And next week, Dr. Carl Jones, who is an amazing individual who saved the Mauritius kestrel from extinction and was hugely involved in the recovery of pink pigeons and echo parakeets, is coming, and we're going to have a sit down and a chat about closer working ties with Durrell and how we move forward. Because I'll tell you, the sobering thing is, guys, that when you look at where we are, I mean, I've done quite a few visits just in the last month to farms who wish to rewild or to change the way they're currently farming now, take their tenancies back in and start to chart a different future. And the thing that is truly shocking is that you will walk across unit after unit and you will find tiny little areas of botanical biodiversity on a corner, on a slope, in the smallest and most fragile of environments. I went to one estate in Wales, 3,000 acres on the outskirts of Brecon, and in between walking and taking a quad bike around the sheep pastures, I found, on the whole of 3,000 acres, I found one old quarry pond full of old leaking drums of some toxin that we couldn't even identify, and that was the only cluster of common frog tadpoles we found in the 3,000 acres. I went out into the sheep lands and some of the tenanted farms behind the main estate, and it was ghastly, absolutely ghastly. I mean, I don't know if anybody's involved with nature conservation grazing here, but in the time I've been involved with nature conservation grazing, everybody keeps on debating what kind of animal is going to eat junkus. And somebody will say, well, have you tried alpacas? What about a donkey? Would goats like it? And then I can honestly say that virtually nothing likes to eat shit soft rush. But on those tenanted farms behind the main estate, those sheep had taken the soft rush down to that. We have a lot of rebuilding to do. And when we start to talk about rebuilding, this is not going to be something that's light. If we're going to return animals like water voles meaningfully to a landscape, we are going to need thousands, and then we're going to need tens of thousands. If we're going to return wildcats, we're going to need the same. And we're going to need to repeat the restoration again and again, maybe starting with that animal in the southwest of England, in Cornwall and Devon, but moving 50s and 60s of kittens up into Devon and Dorset and into environments which, when they're returned to where they should be, they can reoccupy well. If we're going to return beavers, we're going to need thousands of them as a seed stock. And time after time, when you look at a whole galaxy of different species, some of which are common, and some of which we always assume will recover, it may be that they won't. Things like adders now are a species that if you look at the Observer's Book of British Mammals, they'll tell you it's a common and widespread snake. That's no longer the case. This snake exists in pockets and tiny fragments of its former range. They're not very mobile at all, and it's very likely that many of the small, fragile populations that exist now are going to do nothing other than dwindle and become extinct, even if you can recreate a vole prey base for them. So we're going to have to look really seriously. If we want to recover nature, it's going to involve cultivating creatures and reproducing creatures to restore creatures to areas where the habitat can be recreated, but which they can't possibly find unless you put them there. So that's in part what the farms become. We have breeding facilities for white storks, we have black storks, wildcats, harvest mice, thousands of water voles, quite a few beavers, and I'm quite sure that after the conversations we've had with Jersey, we'll be looking at other things in the fullness of time. But we're going to need centres, and we're going to need individuals who are capable of producing these. And what I would like to say, just to finish this, is that I think farmers could have a very real role in this. Farmers are bloody good at producing livestock. Nature conservationists are bloody good at producing paperwork and talking a long and weary story. They produce reports that nobody ever reads. They do feasibility studies. They come up with the most infantile of obstacles. Whereas if you've just got people who have a production-based mentality, who look at what the problems are and overcome them, they have much to offer a future when it comes to wildlife restoration. And as a final footnote to that, we have, something like 3 or 4 breeding pairs of wildcats. We have one bunch that we use for film and photographic work. If you go into their pen, they will be sitting there. And you can take the most wonderful photographs of an authentic wildcat lying on a log. And all the other ones are up in a breeding facility that was very kindly created with grant assistance from the Goldsmiths Foundation. And they don't see anybody. They're in a forest, they're on their own, and you go ask the girls what they see of these animals, and they'll say nothing. They just disappear into the grassland in their pens and into the scrubland in their pens. We hardly ever see them at all. And those ones are the ones that are going to be the good candidates for restoring to the wild. But it's going to be a really stiff learning curve.
And we talked about the opposition that you face, but there are good folk who've helped you along the way.
There are a brilliant galaxy of people who've helped, and I mean, people like Chris, an amazing example of that, and Archie as well. He's spoken very eloquently on behalf of beavers. There are people who are remarkable, like Dr. Roisin Campbell-Palmer, who over the course of the last 2 years has moved hundreds of beavers, which would otherwise have been shot on the banks of the Tay, down to projects in England. Even though they're in enclosures at this point in time, Natural England tell me that they're getting round to considering wild releases out onto rivers, and that by the time we get to the end of this year, there should be a strategy in place to accommodate that. Gerhard Schwab, who was the guy that helped us get all the beavers at the beginning, and he's just this Teutonic figure that's moved maybe 1,000 beavers in his lifetime from Bavaria out to Romania and Bulgaria and to many other countries which are infinitely poorer than us, but who acted decades before we did to restore this creature, is the most remarkable man. And then increasingly there's a galaxy of others. I mean, you meet people. Nature's going to be saved, and change is going to come, not because government stands in and comes up with some whizzorama ideas and employs a lot of bureaucrats to make sure they happen. Nature's going to be changed and saved by people. It's going to be remarkable people who stand up and say, we can do. And you're finding increasingly, from the lords at the top, people like Jim Lowther and Lord Chumley, to little people who have small areas of land, the enthusiasm for that is rising. And what we've got to do, and what we should be doing, is looking at how we enable that and give those people the tools and expertise they desperately need, and maybe sometimes the animals as well, to enable them to achieve their full potential. That's how we're going to make this sing and dance. That's how we're going to return nature to life.
And just before we take questions, would you just tell us a bit where you did restore the beavers howling our back on the River Otter?
Okay, so the River Otter was a really interesting kind of like watershed in time. Nobody knows how the beavers got onto the River Otter, but beavers all of a sudden appeared in the River Otter. My theory is it's an Ice Age refugia that, with global warming accelerating in the way it has done, has just pinged them right out onto that river, I don't know, from some small frosty catchment at the side. Anyway, it had been known there was a beaver on the River Otter for some time, and then probably a beaver of the opposite sex escaped. And then all of a sudden there's some little amateur chap who takes some film camera footage of baby beavers playing around their mum and dad on the River Otter, and you look at it and think, woohoo. And it was quite obvious at that point in time that government, who were not well disposed to beavers, were either going to have to say, well, they've returned, or say, we're going to kill them all. Owen Patterson was in charge at the time, so guess what path he took? But as soon as he said kill them all, the uproar was considerable. There were amazing meetings, in the village hall where there were so many hundreds of people there that they had to go to another hall to get more chairs to accommodate them all. And little girls stood up and spoke, and old people stood up and spoke about how amazing this was, that these animals were here and how much they appreciated having the opportunity to live with them again. Eventually, Devon Wildlife Trust put a licence to Natural England in, and it was a licence which had a foregone conclusion, which was that they were going to get the licence because there was no option, other than to say they can stay because you couldn't kill them, and there was no space in any zoos to put any beavers at all. And at that point in time, too, what was amazing and really gratifying was that people from the farming community, like Vicky Lawrence and her husband, stood up and said, well, when people said, can we come and catch the beavers on your farm? Or the Angling Trust said, can we come and do a piece for Channel 4 News about how terrible these animals are because they build dams and they stop migratory fish running up the river? They just turned around and said, fuck off. And that was the end of it. So, you had all sorts of characters for the first time. In fact, even the NFU, where we're really, God bless them, were actually really, really good about it. I mean, they said, well, look, we're not going to fight and die over a few beavers in the River Otter. We don't want to fall out with you guys because there's going to be another future that's going to be more difficult, and we're going to have to chart some very difficult paths. So what we'll do is we'll agree not to press brief against you, and you'll agree not to press brief against us. And if we're told by our bosses to say something we think you don't like, we'll tell you about it first. And if you're told by your bosses to do the same, could you just give us a call? And they worked perfectly with us on this occasion. So I think the appetite for change is there. I don't think we're pushing against a closed door anymore. It's just a case of how quickly we roll this out and how seamless that rollout needs to be. At the moment, I've had an email from Natural England for a beaver enclosure down in Cornwall where they're insisting that we put a 10-centimetre barred grill on 2 clay outflow pipes of an estate pond that are 6 inches in diameter. Now, I didn't take physics at school, and I don't know how many of you have seen a beaver, but you're looking at an animal that is... What's it? It's the shape of a gigantic watermelon, okay? It weighs about 20 kilos. So even if you grease it really well with the sort of stuff that they sell in Ann Summers shops, and then you stuff its head in the pipe and smack its arse with a cricket bat, it's not going to fucking fit, okay? You might jam that pipe on its head, but it's sure as hell not going to come out the other end. And it's that sort of utter crap that basically slows the whole process down. We don't need to be doing this and have this kind of like penny parochial pinchy attitude whereby subsection C126 is always filled out. We just need to sort of like take a deep breath and jump.
And does anybody want to jump in with a question for Derek?
We farm about 80 acres of floodplain meadows along the Thames.
Yep.
Lots of snakes and patularies, make lots of hay. We've noticed some what we think is beaver damage, and I've read a book that's very exciting. How do beavers fit in with sort of species-rich floodplain meadows?
Well, there's no such thing as beaver damage, you just have habitat creation, okay? So damage, there's no such thing as damage. Well, beavers make floodplain meadows. I mean, I'm not going to go to the tedium of it, but basically, a beaver-generated wetland takes 150 years as a cycle to fully evolve. What happens at the beginning is beavers find a stream flowing through deciduous woodland, and they block the stream with a dam. And then, to get to the trees at either side, they build more and more and more dams. So before you know where you are, you have this landscape that looks like a multi-tiered wedding cake. All the dams start to fill with silts, and the trees move further and further away from the reach of the beavers. And so the beavers build canals from the side of the dams to reach the trees because they need the trees as a winter food reserve, and they jam them, they harvest them, jam sticks and boughs down into the sediments next to the lodge or the burrow they're living in, and then feed them this over winter. Eventually, if you're a beaver living in a climate where you have a harsh winter, you will exhaust your woody debris supply to the point where one winter it fails or is washed away, you will starve and be eaten by wolves, and the wetland you have created with all these pools full of silts will revert into a big, wet floodplain meadow. We farmed them when we came. And when you look at the accounts of the old North American settlers, the places they always wanted to farm were the valley bottoms, because the rich, deep sediments laid down by the beavers over millions of years were things they could exploit and cultivate rich crops in. So beavers create those environments. How will they function in your environment? Well, if you've got a lot of ditches and there's a lot of willow growing along a lot of ditches, it's going to be a lot wetter by the time they finish than it was to begin with. But we can drain beaver dams if we want to. We can take the dams down. There are a range of different mitigation methods we can use to collaborate with them. But the important thing is that it must not mask this empirical need to give land back to nature. We cannot forever look at farming as being the only solution for nature. Sooner or later, sooner rather than later, we're going to have to say enough. And certainly where I farm in West Devon, you know, if we had wet years, we'd be liver fluking those sheep 6 weeks at a time. And even then, we'd lose sheep. And you look at it, and the absolute conclusion is we're trying to keep too many sheep on a landscape that's too wet, and in the end, the parasites will beat us. And to do it, we're stripping the valley bottoms bare. Those valley bottoms were never meant to farm. They're unfarmable land. The best thing we do is we give them back to water. And if you give them back to water, then nothing a beaver's ever going to do is any problem for anybody. But, I mean, if you're on the Thames, I assume they're probably ones from the Cotswold Water Park. So the good news for you, but the bad news for beavers, is they're all sterilised and they can't reproduce. So, which is a real bloody shame. But you can blame Rasheen for that. That was when she was younger and more of a fascist. She's lost her tortoise today, so if she's listening in, she'll be weeping again.
Hi Derek. I was listening to Janet Hughes earlier in the Big Top 10. She's saying as part of the Sustainable Farming Initiative, any sort of actions that will benefit carbon, biodiversity and water are going to be prioritised. And I wondered how close or likely it is that something connects our farmland by carrying strips across the whole country might be a neat solution.
It's what everybody's talking about. I mean, when you look at the new woodland creation announcement that was made 2 weeks ago by the Forestry Commission, they're talking about that. If you're looking at the as you say, the ambitions for elms, that's part of it. If you're looking at other companies coming in, as the Treasury are now suggesting they should do to make up the 3.3 billion that farmers will be getting as subsidies, then they're looking to people like Severn Trent Water and Affinity Water and others to make up the shortfall. And you can quite clearly see how those companies are going to look at things like that and think, well, you know, actually, it makes a heck of a lot more sense to hold that water clean, pure, and more of it in the landscape and pay people to look after it for us than it does to spend the millions we're spending on constantly cleaning the pollution that goes into the water supply from agriculture. Makes complete sense. But those people are going to come and spend money on a different basis. And it does mean that you as a farmer are going to have to do what they tell you to do. And this idea that you're just going to get single farm payment for doing bugger all is over. It's done. And that's going to be quite a big... I mean, I'm assuming you're all forward-thinking people here. Hands up, everybody who thinks they're forward-thinking. Why have you not got your hand up? Okay, so the point of it is that for the people that surround us in the landscape, they're a decent bunch of guys. I really like them. But if you turn round to the dairy farmer next door and said, see all this land in the valley bottom, Derek? It's going to be a gigantic wetland. How do you feel about that? The answer would be he's not a happy farmer, even if it makes commercial sense. So, but yes, it's coming, I think. It's coming.
Beavers on salt marsh. They're going in brackish water.
They'll move through brackish water and they'll move through the sea. If they spend more than 2 or 3 hours in the sea and start to drink salt water, then it blows their kidneys and that's the end of them. So they'll use brackish water in the sense as of a passing through medium. Having said that, there have actually been also some really interesting papers written recently about beavers in intertidal habitats in, I think it's like California. And what they found is they found quite substantial populations of beavers, if not in mangrove, then certainly in areas that are inundated by the sea on a regular basis, but with fresh water flowing in all the time, and the beavers are building dams in those environments. And the interesting thing, again, if you're looking at fisheries, is that the study that that was done there demonstrates quite graphically that these complex woody debris environments that the beavers generate and that are encrusted with crabs living in the bottom are very important refugia for the smolts of migratory game fish. So we might get some surprises. And just to finish on that, actually, does anybody know what tufa is? Does anybody come from Derbyshire or farm up there? Okay, so a few years ago, I was up on the Dove, I think. Just mid-Derbyshire, and it's a river that's got a very high limestone content. And the waterkeeper took me out to see a valley bottom where there are all these structures running through the watercourse with water tipping in and out of them from different angles. And he said, "What do you think that is?" And you look at it and think, is it a Victorian water garden? Because these things are quite obviously the concrete constructs, and it possibly was a pleasure garden. And he said, "No, that's tufa. It's a limestone. It forms these things like rocks in with rock. The limestone collects on algae. It forms something that looks like a pebble, and then anything it touches over time solidifies." So when you actually start to think that through, if you had an animal at one point in time that was building woody debris dams right the way through that landscape, it must have been the most amazing construction with, holes and crayfish and eels and all manner of things lurking in its depths. So not quite salt marsh, but it gives you some sort of vision mentally as to what that perhaps might have looked like.
Brilliant. Thank you. Are there any other questions?
Do you advocate, as the wildlife regeneration program that you're advocating and I think could happen with enthusiasm for farmers, with that growth, there is obviously the predators that grow alongside. To give this all a good kickstart, and what have you, do you advocate predator control?
Oh gosh, that's not what I thought you were going to say. I think there are times when we have to be realistic about it. Some things are so shattered and so lost now and so isolated physically that if you look at things like corn creeks and the Nene washes, to keep those birds going at all, or the godwits, to give them any prospect of rearing eggs, then yes, you're going to have to keep predators out. And I think that's going to be a reality for a time. But it has to be a targeted reality, and the idea that we do it, I'll be frank, because I come from the West Country, by jumping on the back of a horse and putting on a silly costume and chasing a fox up and down the countryside is utterly unrealistic. It's got to be targeted and it's got to be precise, and on that basis, yes, I think it has a role when it comes to nature conservation.
Do you not think that the badger is a massive predator of all the ground nesting birds, bumblebees, and all that sort of thing, and you'll never get legislation to be able to be lifted to control that?
I think there is an issue with badgers because we have taken out all the major predators. Some years ago, I was in Poland and we were out trying to find elk at night, and the guy I was with saw these really unusual animals in this clearing 2 weeks ago, black stripy faces. And I thought it was raccoon dogs, and he couldn't say what it was in English, so we went through the Collins Guide to Mammals of Britain and Europe, and he said, no, it's this one. It's a badger. And I said, "You're telling me these are unusual animals?" He said, "They're really common in Britain, big sets, colonies." He said, "Yeah, but there are wolves here. They can't live like that. So if you build a big set that's ancient, and you know what set entrances look like and how they infall, then one, the wolves very quickly sit at the side of your paths in the undergrowth and kill you when you go back in and excavate you out." Everything we see when it comes to these mesopredators, these small things going up in number, is a direct result of us taking out the bigger things that check them. So I think, to answer your question, yes, there is absolutely a role for badger control, but what I'm not about to do when it comes to ground nesting birds and bumblebees and everything else is I come from a silage landscape. They're taking 4 cuts a year, 5 if they can make it. You look at the damage that's done. If you speak to the old farmers, they will tell you the curlews and the lapwings were the sound of spring. They were everywhere in the skies. We mowed them out. Badgers, the impact that badgers have had compared to what we've done in 70% of the landscape. We can't be using predators as an excuse for our own mistakes. But I think rationally there is a case for doing what needs to be done if you're looking to save shards of nature. Otherwise, no, I have issues with it. And if you want to ask about the return of the wolf, I'm in favour of that. I don't think we'll ever come to terms with nature until we come to terms with the wolf. But read my next book, it'll be all about that.
Excellent indeed. I think unless there's one last question, there is, at the back.
Sorry, I just wondered, are you going to be helping out reviving government's wildlife species reproduction tasks?
No, they don't generally talk to me very much. If they do talk to me, it's when things have gone really badly wrong. So no, I don't think I'll be helping at all. They like timid people to do things like that.
Derek, thank you. That was brilliant. That was so informative and funny. Derek will be signing books at the bookshop right at the back after this, if anybody's up for that. Thank you.